Good afternoon. Please welcome Manager Customer Success in North America at Slack, Dave Macnee.
Hey everybody, thank you very much for coming. My name is Dave. I'm very excited to spend the next 40 minutes or so with everyone on the topic of managing Slack at scale. People are settling in. Let's do the show of hands thing to get everyone back energized after lunch maybe. A show of hands, who here is at least in some part responsible for the success of Slack at their organization? Cool, you may be an executive sponsor, owner, workspace admin, champion, just someone who generally cares a lot about how your team works together. This session is for you, and I really have two goals for today. I would love for everyone to leave with a framework for managing Slack at scale, kind of a mental model, the main things you should be thinking about. And equally as important, I would love for people to leave with 2 or 3 next steps, action items, small wins, things they can take back to their company after today to put this stuff into action and to make a difference. We will do that today through the help of 2 fantastic panelists. We'll also have time for Q&A at the end, so please start thinking of your questions, save them up. And the conversation doesn't have to stop here. We would love to talk to you personally. You can head to that Slack station. There's an admin pod. It's called Managing Slack at Scale. So stop by. We'd love to hear about your journey with Slack, your specific problems, challenges, and we'd love to help. Before we dive in, a little bit of context on me and my role at Slack. I joined in January 2015 on a small but growing sales team. I was actually lucky to be our first customer success manager in October of that year. Customer success at Slack, our mission is to make sure that our customers are able to launch Slack successfully, that they adopt it widely, and ultimately that they're realizing business value from how they use Slack. People in this room know you've made an investment in Slack, and our job is to make sure that you're seeing a return. We have worked with hundreds of customers, really in all verticals, all sizes, small tech startups, Fortune 100 companies, financial services, retail, government agencies, and we've seen a theme emerge for what it takes to manage Slack at scale, and we've broken that down into four key themes. This is the framework I was talking about. We'll use this as our panelists come up to talk through some of the things they've seen. The first thing is slow down to speed up. So when we break this down, we talk about understanding your objectives for your organization, painting that vision for Slack, and then articulating that vision to your organization. The second theme is laying the foundations for scale. In this theme, we talk about building the team that's going to manage Slack, setting expectations, documenting things. Also some simple things like channel naming strategy, being very intentional about how you communicate so that as people join your team in the future, they're able to emulate those behaviors, which is a great way to scale things. The third thing is training and supporting employees. So building the system to accomplish this as your team grows. This is going past kind of classroom-style training and making sure you have a training strategy for your organization. And the fourth thing, measure, evolve, repeat. This is definitely a theme from companies who do this the best. They're very intentional about setting those objectives, measuring them, measuring outcomes, and then putting programs in place to make sure that they're driving the right change. So let's dive in. We'll hear from 2 fantastic panelists, and I would love to invite to the stage Pam Whitmore from Intuit and Guy Martin at Autodesk. All right, a couple quick introductions to get us started. Let's start with a little bit about your role and maybe how you came to manage Slack at your organization. Pam, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so in 2016, I was asked to look at the messaging space across Intuit. We had about 10 messaging products at the time. And of course, Slack came in with winning colors, and I've been managing Slack ever since.
Fantastic. Guy, over to you. I think we'll talk a little bit about how you came to manage Slack, but what is open at Autodesk? Maybe paint that picture.
Yeah, so I have an interesting role at Autodesk. We like to joke that I actually have 3 jobs. I was originally hired to manage our open source strategy and processes, and then we decided, hey, we should take the best practices and development methodologies of open source and apply them internally inside of our projects in our company, so what we call inner source. And then what we kind of soon realized is even though I could do those two things, we really had to have a transformational change in the way that we collaborated and worked together. And so that was kind of what we call my culture change or default to open role. And I kind of accidentally, very similar to Pam, ended up being the person who was charged with going to find a many-to-many collaboration platform. And so that's where I am now.
Yeah, let's. It's a good segue. We'll jump off from there. Talk about that first pause you had. When did you realize you needed a strategy for Slack?
So let's kind of go back a little bit to how we got to that point. So my boss sends me off to look at many-to-many collaboration platforms, and I kind of went out and did a survey, essentially, probably fairly similar to what other people have done and you've heard today. And I found about 400 people off in a corner using HipChat. I found some people trying to use Link before Skype for Business. And then I found 85 separate instances of Slack at Autodesk, which, of course, were 85 different silos, which weren't talking to each other. And so what we decided to do was coalesce all those into a single instance. And that's kind of where we had that first pause of how are we going to do this? And it really wasn't so much a technical challenge, even though there were a little bit of things going on there. It was more of a cultural challenge of getting those teams to kind of give their control up of those 85 instances and come on board to a single instance for greater transparency.
Yeah, let's go a little deeper there. I'm interested in your experience at Autodesk. Was that an inflection point? And maybe advice for the crowd. Do you think as a leader, it's your job to understand when you hit that inflection point and have that strategy? Or is it more of a kind of a continuous process that's going to happen throughout?
So as an open source person, I love the phrase that you have to iterate early and often and release early and often. So I think it's very much not something that you do have to set something in motion, kind of a strategy, but you have to continually evaluate that. And so one of the things I like to say is that it's okay for collaboration to be messy. We're human, right? I disagree with people that say you've got to make everything clean and pristine. Collaboration is messy. The difference is I don't want it to be chaotic. And I think that's really where we've spent a lot of time at Autodesk is thinking about, in order to default to open within our organization and within Slack, we need to really be intentional about capturing that organic growth or that viral growth that we had with Slack, but putting guardrails in place to help people function well in this environment.
Yeah, let's go one deeper on, and we've talked about this before. I love your concept of organic growth with guardrails. Maybe paint that picture a little bit more, and maybe some examples of how you've done that at Autodesk.
Sure. So we were very, very intentional, and I like the fact that you used that phrase. We were very intentional about how we rolled Slack out into the company when we coalesced into this single instance. So a couple of things we did is we really wanted to think about channel naming conventions was a big thing, and we were, I guess, even before we worked with your CSM team, we kind of came up with our own channel naming conventions, and they're something that the community weighs in on. The community that's part of our user base weighs in on those. The other thing we do is we don't have test channels. We actually have 3 corporate-wide test channels, and we're pretty militant about not letting people create their own test channels, because that tends to, if you have 10,000 people, which we do, it tends to lead to a lot of proliferation of channels that aren't very useful. And then the other big thing we did was we wanted to make sure that people tried to put in a clear channel topic and purpose, because discoverability, as you have all talked about in Slack, is a huge thing. Discoverability of channels and getting people really onboarded was something that we wanted to be pretty intentional about. And really, these were all designed to help us adopt this default to open mindset.
And so let's talk about that reduction in private channels. I know this has been something you've thought a lot about.
Yes.
I mean, tell us that story. How have you managed this? And we've got a chart up there that shows the reduction over a course of period of time. How did you do that?
Right. And I know we've talked about this, that this can be a very polarizing topic, right? Some instances want to just let people create as many private channels as they want. I was coming into a culture at Autodesk where we've been very successful at highly verticalized product lines, but as we were moving to cloud, we needed to collaborate and work better together, and we needed to have this default to open mindset. And teams were basically creating a lot of private channels, and we were seeing the private channels go like this, and the public channels go like that. And I basically looked at that and said, well, OK, we're just recreating these 85 instances we've worked so hard to coalesce. So what we have now is a process where we will create a private channel or convert a private channel for you. My admin team will do that, but we have a set of 5 criteria. And they're the things you would probably think of, like finance discussions or legal discussions or patentable IP, those sorts of things. But we don't do this as a punitive thing. We're very intentional about when teams come to us. We want to use this as an educational opportunity. And we've had a lot of teams in the early days of first putting this policy in, because we didn't do it at first, teams were very reluctant to do this. And we used it as an educational opportunity to say, here's why we're doing this. It's safe to do this. It's safe to talk about failure. It's safe to really share everything within the company's enclave.
That's great. We'll come back to that, and I think later on we'll talk about kind of how you manage that and what team manages it. But let's go over to Pam and maybe pick up from here on laying foundations for scale. And first, for the crowd, talk a little bit about Intuit for those that don't know your business and some of the brands and what your business is.
Yeah, so Intuit is a leading provider of financial solutions for both individuals and small businesses. You'll probably know us as TurboTax and QuickBooks. We have about 9,000 full-time employees and another 4,000 or so contract workers all through the year. What's really unique about us is we really ramp up during tax season. So at tax season, we could add another 10,000 employees. So that's kind of what our business looks like, and we've been on Slack for 2 years, and it's really growing like mad.
Yeah, and I'd love to go deeper there. These are big numbers. I mean, you have a lot of people on Slack every day, and then during tax season, it jumps again by a lot. So let's talk about how you do that. I guess the short question is, how do you do it?
Yeah, so tax season is very important to our business, and we. Again, as I mentioned before, we can go between 8 to 10,000 people that have to start before January and through April. And so we've had to put processes in place to do that. And so to get to the additional people, it's kind of a technical thing and a human thing to work through. As far as the technical side, we started out with just onboarding folks through scripts and deprovisioning them the same way. As we got a little bit more mature and started to learn that we needed a little more automation there, we decided to go ahead and sync with our HRIS and use the Slack user group features. And so what happens is when people start on day one, they not only can log into Slack, but they get into the right workspace, and they also can get into the right channels.
Yeah, and a huge impact there, just making sure people are in the right channels with the right team members on day one, ready to do real work. Let's talk about the human side, though, and some of the things you've done to meet people where they're at and kind of meet them as humans on day one.
Yeah, so there's a couple things there. First is around, we have talked about channels. So we invite people into channels. We have facilitators that are helping them have communications in the channels, some emoji workflows as well, so people can be productive right away and people can solve customers' problems.
That's awesome. We're going to come back to measurement at the end in kind of our last theme, and I love some of the stories you have to tell there. But let's talk about this just in the onboarding sense. What are some of the results you've seen from pairing this technical approach to onboarding so many people and also your Learningbot?
Yeah, so one of the things we do in addition to bringing in the channels is what we're calling the Learningbot. And so not only are we teaching people through facilitation methods, but we have a bot that they can ask for more information on product information. So they could be talking to a customer, and they could choose to do a 2 or 4 minute bot session, and they can solve customer problems very quickly. And so we started that in Australia, and we have about 300 to 400 people on it, and we've seen some really great reductions in the amount of time people spend training, as well as facilitators training people, and the assessments for those folks as far as what they're learning is much higher. The scores are much higher than they have ever been before. So it's really going really well, and we're really pleased with it.
Awesome, thank you. Guy, back to you. I mean, this is kind of in line, and we'll pick up on some of the things Pam mentioned, but talk about your approach to training and supporting employees, and let's look just past the onboarding phase. So now that you have everyone in your Slack workspace, how do you do that? What's the team of people that you have that manages that number of people?
Yeah, so it's a fantastic story. I'm very lucky that I actually have a completely volunteer group of admins, which I know is actually a little bit unusual when I talk to other Slack users. And we have 10,000 users in the company, so that's basically most of the folks plus some external single and multi-channel guests. But what we've really done is I went out and I found in our help channel when we were first coalescing these different workspaces into one, I found the people who were answering questions, who were passionate about what we were doing in Slack. And those were the people that I went out and kind of appealed to their ego to say, hey, you're doing a really great job answering questions. Do you want to be a Slack admin? And that's the team that we have now. So we have a team of 7 folks that, and myself that manage our instance. And what we've really done there is tried to create a community. And I loved Lindsay's keynote because it's finally given me sort of language to talk about total motivation. I had no idea what that was, but as an open source and community person, that was just the way I approached building this, was to say, hey, I want to create a community of Slack admins who are passionate and responsible for actually running this thing. And I think it's a fascinating way of looking at it, because while our instance is supported by IT, it's actually managed by myself and these Slack admins. And I think that gives it a little bit different flavor. It's more of a community thing. It's more of people really with high TOMO that are actually helping me drive this.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe one more example. We'll go a little deeper on a process. I mean, we've talked about this, but something simple that the crowd can learn from on how you manage requests. And I'm sure there's a lot for a 10,000 person organization.
There is a lot. So one of the things that we did, first off, is we created a user group called Slack-admins. And the process we have is that people will come into our help channel, sometimes other channels. We try to get them in the help channel to ask these questions. And they'll tag at Slack admins with their request. So that does a couple of things. It's a searchable record for us to go back to later, and it's also something that allows us to have our admin team be geographically dispersed and not have to worry about necessarily tagging one particular admin. So like I'm here at this conference, and I have no fears that my admin team back at Autodesk is actually doing a great job dealing with these sort of day-to-day requests. And this actually gives us a great way to really track what's going on, and gives us, again, something that is an archive, that if we have a question about something that happened, we can go back and look at it. So you're seeing an example right there of a request to create a channel, to convert a channel to private. And we have a set of criteria again, and they list out those criteria. The Slack admins deal with that. We do have a private channel for the Slack admins where we will talk to each other about different things if there's a question. But one of the things that I've tried to do as our lead Slack admin is be just one of the other Slack admins. So I give them a lot of autonomy, what Lindsay was talking about yesterday. I give them a lot of autonomy to make those decisions, and they really only involve me as a tiebreaker, essentially. If there's a concern or a question, they're fully empowered to manage this thing themselves.
And for the crowd, I mean, I think we've seen examples of this before, but I love the simple emoji use. So, eyes means, hey, I'm looking at this.
Yeah, eyes means, hey, I'm looking at this. Check mark means, hey, it's been done. And I was telling this story to somebody the other day. It's actually kind of cool that my admin team is so passionate about this work that there's kind of friendly ribbing in our private admin channel about, hey, you got to that request before I did. So I actually have my admins fighting over who gets to help users, which I think is fantastic.
That's great. It's a great example, too. I mean, we talk a lot about integrations. We saw some stuff earlier today. Kind of very advanced workflows. Sometimes simple things like emoji reactions and just getting a group of people working in channel can be a huge lift.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pam, let's go back to you and talk about our final theme, measure, evolve, repeat. And I guess the question for you is how do you measure the success of Slack at your organization?
Well, so success is really broad. So we measure how valuable Slack is across Intuit, but it's also really important for us to measure user experience. So we look at the adoption metrics, but we go way deeper than that. We want to know if people are being more productive. We want to know if it's positively improving the culture. So NPS is really one of the ways we measure that.
So that's great. We'll talk about NPS. And for folks that don't know, NPS is Net Promoter Score. It is a measure between -100 and +100. In response to a single question survey, how likely are you to recommend Slack to a friend or colleague? So I guess, how are we doing? How are we doing on NPS?
No, it's doing really well, and we're really proud that we're at about a 45. Our goal is to hit 20, so 45 is a really good score, and it means that people are really liking Slack. We use a survey so people can understand, we can understand kind of what people are thinking, and we look at the positive, but we also really look at what are our opportunities and the feedback that we're getting, because we're always looking for room to improve.
So tell us about that. What are a few more ways you slice and dice this data and action it to make sure you're improving the value the organization is getting from Slack?
Yeah, so as we look at the data, we also get slice the data by business unit, by functional group, by location, by job family. So it kind of gives us that feel for what's going on by group. As you can see from the slide, actually when we did our first MPS, finance was actually in the red. So we spent some time creating champions, creating a learning plan, and so we actually got it now up into the yellow. So our job isn't done, but we're kind of heading in the right direction with it. But so the data really gives us areas where we really need to really specifically zoom in on.
I love it, thank you, and love the data-driven approach. I've seen it definitely as a general theme across all the companies we work with. The people who are most successful take a really thoughtful approach, set objectives, measure, and then take action on the data that they see. From here, I thought it'd be fun to go into a bit of a lightning round, and then we'll open it up for some healthy Q&A for the crowd. So we can jump back and forth here. If you could go back in time, what's one thing you would do differently? Let's start with Pam on this one.
Yeah, so really changing the way people work and getting executive sponsorship is probably something I would have done differently, because what we did was we said, okay, we have 10 tools and we want to migrate everybody over to one. So we took kind of the technology view of it. So we're kind of wrapping back and trying to take more of the human view of it.
Yeah, and I would double click on that. I think what we've seen from like the change management side of rolling out Slack and what we see in the the academics behind change management, executive sponsorship is hugely important, and I think is has the highest. It's the attribute that is most highly correlated to success. So making sure you have that sponsor in there early, talking about Slack, but then also participating in channels can be a huge help. Guy, let's go over to you. One thing you would do differently if you could go back in time.
I would deal with the private channel thing from the beginning. I let that go as a community person. I just kind of let that go and figured the community was going to do the right thing, and I didn't really count on the fact that our culture was one where information was closed by default and not open by default. And so we had like about 3 or 4 months where we let that happen, and again, we saw the private channel usage go sky high. And so bringing that back and putting that process in place, yeah, my hair was a little still singed from that experience. It was about 4 or 5 months of people being a little angry at us. So I probably would have addressed that from the beginning, because I think that default to open thing is really what has made Slack a transformational thing at Autodesk. And so yeah, I would have done that differently.
That's great. And I'll point out again that it's so closely related to your strategy, your objectives is this openness. I wouldn't, for the record, I wouldn't recommend necessarily locking down private channels for anyone in the room. And we talked about this way back in the day, the different options we had to foster openness. But I love that you're so focused on seeing those outcomes and put that in place to get it done. Okay, next question. If my clicker will advance us. This is a really tough one. Let's say you're in an elevator. You have 30 seconds to describe Slack to your CEO. Let's start with Guy this time.
So I would say that Slack is the transparency and collaboration engine of your company. It was talked about earlier that you use it to be able to have people at all levels of the organization talking to each other. And it's also the place where kind of the hive mind or the tribal knowledge of your company lives. And we've seen this in spades with what's been going on at Autodesk, where teams just use it for that.
Pretty good. Pam, over to you.
Yeah, so I would say that Slack is a great platform for enabling productivity. But I would really like to mention that it also is really great for employee engagement, which is really important to us.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you. Last question from our lightning round here. What is your favorite channel in Slack? Pam, we'll go for you first this time.
Well, I'm going to choose we have the dogs of Intuit and the cats of Intuit. And what I love about these is it gives people a chance to have fun and to socialize, and to, it's as part of their workday. Because again, Slack is, while it makes people productive, it also needs to be a lot of fun as well.
Yeah, and echoing that theme, I mean, my favorite one is a channel that we have at Autodesk called SF Free Food, because engineers love free food, everybody loves free food, and it's that same thing. It engenders community, but it has another benefit, which is we throw away less food because our food gets eaten. People post something, and it's kind of been a theme where there's this one particular person, and we're trying to figure out what work he actually does, because he's always the first person to post free food. So we're like, what are you doing? But no, it's a great channel. Love it.
There's also a pro tip there in the launch phase of your journey. If you're trying to drive adoption, just only announce the free food in Slack is kind of a sure thing.
Exactly.
That's great. We've intentionally saved a lot of time for Q&A. I would love to hear from the crowd. Any questions for Pam and for Guy? Sure. And I think we have some folks with mics coming around. Let's start right back there, please.
Hi there, thanks for the talk. I was hoping either one of you, or actually all three, could talk a little bit more about vendor management strategies, particularly provisioning them and differentiating between single channel and multi-channel, because as we all know, a lot of our work is done by temporary teams, especially in Pam's case, and teams that work all over the world. So vendor management, how do you make it happen?
I guess I'll go and then Pam. We manage it in the same way that we manage things like private channels, where you saw tagging at Slack admins. So we do that, and we do it in the public channel, the public help channel, so that we have a record of that. For us, it's especially important because we want to make sure that we have the person who's doing the request understanding that if you're bringing somebody into a channel, they're either under NDA or the stuff in the channel is not anything Autodesk proprietary. So we ask that they kind of give us that request in a very specific format, telling us who the user is there an NDA in place, et cetera, and then we do that in that public channel so that we have a record of that later. And actually, our legal team really appreciates that, because we can always go back and look at a particular person that came in. And by default, we will do single channel. We like to do single channel unless there's a reason, because we can always upgrade them to a multi-channel guest later.
Yeah, and ours is real different because we have a couple different kinds of vendors, right? So we have outsourcers en masse, right, which are basically our vendor. And so we actually put them in their own workspace, because that way we can control exactly what they do and exactly what their rights are and all of that. So that's one type of vendor that we have, and again, it's kind of workspace managed. The other type would be a vendor, kind of like Guy mentioned, which we do something similar, where we bring them in as a guest, usually a single channel guest, and then we manage their access. We're giving them 90 days in a channel, and then they have to renew if they're going to continue to be a vendor with us.
Great, thank you. I think we had a question up here. Go for it.
My question is, if you're discouraging direct channel for employees, correct?
Private channel.
Private channels, what do you ask them to use as an alternative?
So if they're less than 8 people, they can use a multi-party direct message. Now, there obviously are some challenges around that. What teams have done, if they really, really insist on being private, is they've taken it off of Slack, and they've gone back to email. And some would say that that's not a win. I look at it as this way. We're trying to encourage a behavior that you don't talk about things in private just because you always have. And so if the team goes off and does that in email, I can't help that. But what I don't want to have happen is us spending all the time and effort we did to coalesce those 85 workspaces basically go for naught, because everyone's just recreating those silos in the single instance we have.
I might add my 2 cents on this. I think we've seen, from a customer success standpoint, we've seen people approach this problem in many different ways. Guy has a mandate to drive openness at Autodesk. A tactic that we've found to work is more of an incremental approach, and really the value of Slack is when groups of people work together in channels, and that's when you unlock the power of the search. You're able to look back and find decisions that have been made, and we found that when department leaders or managers take the time to say in response to a direct message or maybe a private channel is spun up, if that leader is able to say, hey, this is a great question, or I love the work that's happening here, let's move this over to this channel, just that kind of quick in-the-moment coaching from a manager can start to set the precedent for this is how our organization is moving, and it takes a little bit of vulnerability to put yourself out there a bit, but making that small change a few times I think can have a great impact as well. Yes, right over here.
Hello, thank you for sharing. So I was wondering, when you two as admins had like questions about the product or like wanted to learn more, what outlets did you find as like the most useful to help?
Our favorite customer success manager? No. Actually, he's not my customer success manager, but what's interesting is we've had several people in terms of sales reps and CSMs touch our account, and they're all still at Slack, which I think is fantastic. They're doing different things now. But yeah, I usually would reach out to our CSM. One of the things that we've done as a best practice is in our private admin channel, we have the Slack people from our account, either the CSM, the account rep, all those folks are in our private admin channel, so we can ping them directly if we have an issue or if we need something done.
Hi, quick question. What did you say again was the criteria that you use to determine if they can have a private channel?
I have to remember all 5. There's finance discussions, legal discussions, HR personnel discussions, strategic IP, and then there's a 5th one that I can never remember. External vendors, thank you. One of my Slack admins is in the audience and helped me out. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Sure, right here.
Yeah, we're only about 2 months into adopting Slack, and one of our biggest pain points is DMs. We can't get people out of DMs, so I'm just wondering if you have any tips or experiences that have worked well for you.
Sure, I'll open it up to Pam.
Yeah, I can start with that one. I actually have quite a few DMs as well. So we're trying to encourage people to communicate in channels. So because we believe that we want to work openly as much as possible, right? So we keep that culture growing. But to your point, I think over time we're not again having quite as much DMs, but still we're really heavy in the DMs as well. But again, I think it's just a culture to build.
Yeah, I mean, we have the same issue, right? I mean, we have the vast majority of our messages are in DMs, which I think is not unusual for a Slack instance. Same thing. I think we just try to make sure that we encourage them to put it in a public channel so that everyone can learn from what they're talking about. And there are plenty of cases where a multi-party DM makes sense if you're just chit-chatting and it's not anything critical. But basically, our point is we're using this to try to run the business and to distribute the knowledge, the tribal knowledge of the company, and they have to do that in a public channel for it to be viable.
I would maybe add to that, well, a couple things. First, if you're looking at your analytics dashboard and you're looking at the percentage of messages that are DMs versus channel messages, I think sometimes the data is a little bit skewed, because if I was saying, hey, do you want to go for lunch? Enter burrito, ? Enter tacos, ? Enter. Like, there's a few messages there already. So I think that the way people communicate in DM is often a little bit more rapid, which skews the data a little bit. And then I would go back to that in-the-moment coaching thing. And really a good indication is if someone else in the future is going to benefit from the question or the conversation that's happening in a DM, be brave, take the time to put it in a channel. Things like channel naming conventions are so simple, but those are signposts for people to figure out where the content is going to be most helpful to others in the organization. So I would lean on that as well. Sure.
Speaking of channel naming conventions, we just started at our facility using Slack, and we had huge debates about how to name channels. Didn't know if there was best practices that you've found using Slack for the last few years. It would be very helpful for us.
Okay, I'll take that one. So we actually have prefixes. Slack gave us kind of a list that was really helpful when we started out. So we have like community of dogs, CMTY in front of ours, if it's a community, or we've put our business unit in front, so all our business unit channels are all in a row. So there's a number of prefixes we use that make it a lot easier to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, we do the same thing in terms of prefixes. So one of the ones that we actually reserve is ADSK, our stock symbol. We reserve that prefix for channels that have a wide applicability from a business standpoint to the entire business. We do things like tech dash whatever for technical types of things. We actually, one of the things we try to do is have either regional prefixes. So I mentioned SF dash free food. If channels are not business related, we try to have them prefixed with fun dash whatever. So fun dash 5K run or things like that. It helps it makes it easier when people go to look and try to find out what they're looking for.
Check out Slack's Help Center. On the Help Center, there's an article with other examples of what teams have done, different prefixes, how things are grouped, sometimes by project or department. So there's good ideas there. The other advice I'd give you is it will take a little effort to kind of establish that. So you have to put it out there, but it's in everyone's best interest to have the common taxonomy, right? So I've found that if you can do it as intelligently as possible and put it out there, everyone benefits and people will kind of jump on it. So you just have to get over that initial hump of effort, I guess, before you get the benefit back.
And I would also just add that it's not set in stone, and probably with your case too. We allow teams. We have a list of them in a post, and we say, look, if this isn't working or you think we need another prefix, let us know, and we'll suggest that.
It's a great call, and I think the theme there is avoid the temptation to create 1,000 channels perfectly named on day one. Part of the point of Slack is that you're pushing some of the decision making to people closest to the information and closest to the problem. So let those people make smart decisions and let Slack kind of change and adapt as it grows. Time for maybe one or two more? Sure. Let's go to the back first, and then over here next, I promise.
So as you scale, what are the most important apps to integrate with Slack?
Ooh, that's a good question. And I think it kind of depends on what your business is about. Obviously, the GitHub integration was huge for us. I mean, that's probably our #1 integration. The Jira integration was very big for us. Also, and this is a common theme that I've heard in other presentations here, our Slack usage really started in engineering. So those are the kind of engineering type ones we have. We're actually using Guru now as well. So those are kind of a couple of the big three for me.
Yeah, I agree. It's really kind of by job, right? Because you're right. We have all those engineering integrations, but we also, a lot of people will use all of the integrations that are for planning and task management and all of that kind of stuff as well. So it just depends.
Great, thanks. Over here.
Have you made an effort to change how you use email in relation to Slack?
Well, that's an interesting question because we would love to have fewer emails. However, we can tell folks, email's probably not going to actually go away. So I do have a lot of people that say, I don't really use email anymore. So there are a number of folks that are primarily using Slack, but again, email in our company still has a purpose. And we're hoping to use it less, but we'll probably always use them together.
Yeah, I think that's consistent with us too. There has been a little bit of decrease, but not a whole lot. There's an email story that I actually do want to share that's kind of interesting. We had holdouts that did not want to get on Slack early on, and they insisted on staying in email. And eventually, their team started having the discussions in Slack and not copying them on email. And you can imagine what happens then. They're like, oh, I guess I have to do this. But once we got them over, they kind of saw the benefit, and they use less email now.
Yeah. And maybe for context, and if it's of interest, so at Slack, I think Stuart said the other day we're maybe 12 or 1,300 people. So we send 0 email at Slack, as you might imagine, but we all still have an inbox, and my inbox is just external. So I know that our internal work is happening in Slack, and it's actually quite helpful for me to have an inbox that's only customers and external information. That kind of separation has been really helpful for me. Maybe time for one more. I think we're almost out of time. Sure, last question.
Was there someone else? Or? So you talked about, and this is really interesting because I feel like people don't look at their email analytics or their email usage as a barometer for how the organization's working as much as Slack is. But I wonder if there are things that you pick up on that are warning signs or things that you're interested in that you're seeing through Slack for the first time, and how are you responding to that? Are you using Slack as the primary vehicle for doing some of that change, or are you realizing, oh, this is a much larger organizational issue?
Maybe clarify a little bit. What are some of the things you're thinking of here?
Well, it's, say, for example, big company announcement and a flurry of DM activity occurs. Like, is that something that you look into? Is that something that you're interested in?
And you mean from a statistics standpoint, like looking at the analytics?
Sure. Like, maybe there's rumors that we're going to have a big merger, and like public channel drops off, and everyone jumps into DM.
Sure, I can speak to that, but I'd love your take.
Yeah, so I mean, we have some of that kind of stuff where there's an announcement and then there's a flurry of information going on, and typically that's in Slack, which is really good because it gives us an ability to kind of look at that and look at what's going on in the culture. It's kind of a cultural question, if I'm understanding. And again, I like that a lot about Slack because you're not going to get that in email or any other way, but you're definitely going to see if something's going on. Some of the channels really light up.
Yeah, and I would, sorry, go for it.
I was just going to say, we look at the analytics on a fairly macro level, right? Where things I'm tracking most are amount of messages sent, the previous week. We get the email every week. But when we take a look at it, we're looking at number of users registered, what's our average user rate, which 10,000 users, we have about 7,000 to 7,500 using it every month. So I keep a pretty close eye on that. Public channel to private channel and DM. But I don't spend a whole lot of time necessarily focusing on when there's an event that happens and tracking analytics that way. I think primarily because the DM stuff can be very misleading sometimes.
Yeah, I think my advice would be, if you're using Slack, if your team is communicating in channels, you probably get more information from what people are saying in those channels rather than trying to dig it out of an analytics dashboard. And I think that's part of the value of Slack. When you're communicating in channels, you have this ambient awareness of what's happening in the business, and you actually don't have to search sometimes for those insights in a dashboard. The other thing I'd say on stats is the way Pam is looking at measuring success at Intuit is great. I mean, she's looking at adoption for sure, how many people are using it, but also what's the maturity, how are they using it, and then, well, user sentiment as well in NPS, but then what are the business results? You saw some of those stats on faster time to productivity, and I think that's the best case or the best practice is to think about the success of Slack in terms of what your business is able to accomplish. I think we have to chop it there. I hear people milling around outside. A quick recap here. I'll flash up these 4 themes. Again, this is kind of your framework, your roadmap. I'd love for people to think about where they're at in their journey with Slack. And again, target a couple of small wins that you can take back to your company. We would love to chat. We're at the booth called Managing Slack at Scale. And thank you again, everyone, for your time, and to our fantastic panelists for joining us.